Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Our next presenter will be Joel Schwartz, author of Air Quality in America, A Dose of Reality on Air Pollution Levels, Trends, and Health Risks. He's a consultant specializing in environmental policy, regulation, and science. He has been a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and directed the Reason Public Policy Institute's Air Quality Project. I find interesting that as executive officer for the state of California's Inspection and Maintenance Review Committee, Schwartz led a legislative mandated evaluation of California's vehicle emissions inspection program. He has also served as a senior policy analyst with the California Legislative Analyst's Office, as a consultant with the South Coast Air Quality Management District and the RAND Corporation, and as a staff scientist at the Coalition for Clean Air. Joel Schwartz.
Thank you, and thank you to the Heartland Institute for inviting me. I'm going to talk today about one small aspect of the issue of climate change and human health. Does anybody know how to start the slideshow in Vista? Is that it? Okay, there we go. Okay. So as you probably know, California has adopted probably the most aggressive climate change policy in the world, not only in the sense that and I live in California, not only in the sense that we've said we're going to do it, but we're really actually doing it, unlike places like Europe or Japan or Canada, where they sign on to Kyoto and thump their chests and say, look at how great we are, but don't actually achieve any reductions. In California, our California Air Resources Board is actually going ahead and implementing these reductions. So we're going to be a guinea pig for the nation and the world to see what actually happens when you implement a serious policy to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. I'm going to talk to you about one aspect of California's adoption and implementation of its climate plan, and that is what regulators told legislators in order to get them to adopt the climate regulations, and then what regulators are telling Californians and the state's elected officials about what implementing that plan is going to cost. And I'm going to compare what the regulators said with the actual observations of climate and with the actual economic analyses of independent economists. So let's start with the briefing that California EPA gave to legislators when those legislators were considering the very first legislation. This is AB 1493. It's a legislation that requires auto manufacturers to increase the fuel economy of cars sold in California. This was adopted before AB 32, which is California's overall climate plan requiring large reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. And AB 1493 is a key part of that, since transportation is the largest part of California's greenhouse gas emissions. So this is part of the AB 1493 briefing that Cal EPA gave to the legislature. This is a chart on sea level. We have a buoy, a tide gauge that has been measuring sea level in the San Francisco Bay since the 1850s. So we have a very long record of sea level in California. And Cal EPA showed that to the legislators. This is 1854, and this is 2000. This briefing was done, I think, in 2004 or 2005. And you can see that there has indeed been a rise in sea level during the last 100 years or so. But one of the things that I think this shows is that whatever was causing that sea level rise, it couldn't have started because of greenhouse gas emissions, because humankind emitted 90% of all their greenhouse gas emissions after 1920, and yet sea level already started to rise in the 1920s before we'd emitted many greenhouse gases. So in a sense, if you actually look at what this chart's telling you, it doesn't seem to be telling you what the Cal EPA was telling the legislators that it says. Now, if you take a closer look at more recent data, and we have data going through this is 2007, we even have data through 2008 now. The red line is the annual average sea level, just like Cal EPA showed, and the black line is the 10-year moving average. And you can see that not only has sea level been rising since the early 1900s, but in addition, even though you'd expect rising carbon dioxide to speed up sea level rise if that was causing the problem, in fact, if anything, we've had a slowdown in sea level rise in California in the last few decades. It's just about stopped during the last 30 years or so. There hasn't been any sea level rise. It's something that Cal EPA unfortunately didn't mention to California legislators. Another thing that Cal EPA told told California legislators is that we're losing our ice pack, which is our water supply in California. And they showed them this chart. You can see what the chart says. It's percent of water year runoff that occurs between April and July each year. This is from 1910 to 2000. And you can see that it's dropping, which gives the impression that our water supply is dropping. But what this number that they've plotted is not the absolute amount of water runoff coming off from from the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's actually the ratio of the amount of runoff coming off between April and July to the amount of runoff coming off during the entire year. So this ratio could drop if April to July runoff decreased, which would mean a decrease in our water supply, but could also drop if total runoff increased. So let's look at the absolute amounts of runoff. This is the April to July runoff, which is the important number for water supply, and this is the full year runoff. Once again, the thin lines are the annual values, and the thick black lines are the 10-year moving averages. What I think you can see here is that there have been some changes over time, but if anything, during the last few decades, we're at about the long-term average, which is what this line represents. So we haven't had a long-term decrease or increase. We're right at about the 100-year average for the last few decades. And of course, during the Dust Bowl and during the early 90s, we had two droughts where you can see the runoff decreased. And you can also see that there was a bit of a rise in full-year runoff, which is what mainly explains the decline that Cal EPA showed the legislators. So the real story was much more benign than what the legislators were told. And if you go back even further in time, and you can do that using proxies, in this case, some researchers from NOAA used tree rings. They did that. They did those same estimates that I showed you before from 1900 to 2000. They went back to 900 AD, looking once again at Sacramento River runoff, and this is full year runoff. And you can see what it looked like. Once again, annual averages and the black line being 10-year moving averages. Here's what I just showed you. You can see that the long-term variability in the system is about what we saw over the last 100 years. There have been ups and downs and no real long-term trends. And so once again, if you look at the very long term on a human scale, there's really nothing special about the last 100 years or so. As John Dunn just told you, another claim is that climate change is going to increase deaths from heat stress. Once again, Cal EPA's briefing to legislators showed these projections of heat-related mortality during the 1990s, 2020, and then 2050 for various areas around the country, and you can see that those bars are rising. So the claim is there are going to be more heat deaths because of rising temperatures, on the assumption that if you have a certain rate of heat deaths now, as temperature rises, you're going to have more of them later. But if you look at the actual trend in heat-related mortality in the United States, it's actually dropped quite a bit during the last few decades. In fact, one of the authors of this study is sitting in the audience, Chip Knappenberger. And from the 1960s to the 1990s, he and his colleagues showed that the risk of dying from heat in the United States dropped by about 75%. And here's the 28-city average for the United States from that study. And here are the trends from all the different cities that were included in the study. And in fact, the most interesting thing about this is not only that there was a decline in heat-related mortality as the Earth was warming, but also that the cities with the highest temperatures have the lowest risk of heat-related mortality. In other words, people adapt. When they live in hot climates, they use air conditioning. They know to go inside and not to go out running when it's 110 degrees. They have better emergency medical care and so on. And so it's actually the hottest places that have the lowest mortality. So even though heat-related mortality in Los Angeles had been dropping for 30 years, for some reason, regulators are predicting that heat-related mortality is going to rise in the future. I think the only way that would happen is if regulators make it too costly to use air conditioning to protect ourselves from the heat. And in fact, the whole issue is really a red herring anyway, because even if it were true that rising temperatures were going to cause more heat-related mortality, cold kills many more people than heat. And so even if it were true that you would get more heat deaths it would be more than offset by the decline in coal deaths. And here are just 3 studies that have looked into that. Keating in the British Medical Journal, who John Dunn cited, Martin's study in Social Science and Medicine, and Toll's group in Ecological Economics. In fact, Toll and colleagues predicted a net reduction of 172,000 deaths per year due to the combination of potential increases in heat-related deaths, but declines in cold-related deaths as a result of warming. So the economists are actually predicting net declines in mortality due to warming. Another thing that regulators were telling legislators is that higher temperatures mean more air pollution. And here's the graph they showed, and this is temperature. This is ozone levels, and you can see there's a correlation between temperature and ozone. Well, that's true. There is a correlation. One of the things that affects ozone levels is temperature. All else equal, if you raise temperatures, you're going to get a little more ozone. But what's much more important is how much ozone-forming pollution you put into the air. Ozone is formed from volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides that are emitted by cars and factories and consumer products and so on. Well, we've been getting rid of almost all of those emissions over the last few decades, and we're going to keep getting rid of them. In fact, if you go to CARB's website and look at their prediction of future emission inventories due to their regulations that they plan to adopt for volatile organic compounds and factories and transportation and nitrogen oxides and so on, they're going to get rid of 80 or 90% of those emissions during the next 20 years or so. This is after getting rid of most of the emissions that existed, and we're going to get rid of 80 or 90% of what's left now in the future. So this is why in the United States, even though we've had rising temperatures, we've had declining ozone and we've had declining particulate matter. That's national averages. This is Los Angeles. This is the number of days exceeding the 8-hour, 85 parts per billion ozone standard from 1985 to 2005. This is 41 monitoring sites with continuous data around California. And you can see there's been a huge decline in ozone levels in California, even as temperatures have risen. And in fact, ozone didn't just decline on average, it declined at every single site, every single one of those 41 sites in the state, and the sites that had the largest declines were the ones that started out with the highest ozone levels. The only sites that didn't have a negative slope were the ones that were already at 0 ozone exceedances per year. They just stayed at 0. And if you look nationally at the effective temperature in ozone, you can see that it's declining. This is a chart that shows you the likelihood of an ozone violation on a day that has temperatures greater than 90 degrees. This is for the 1-hour ozone standard. That's the old standard. This is for the 8-hour standard at 85 parts per billion. That's the newer standard. So this is the ratio. This tells you the likelihood of an ozone violation on a hot day. This is an average for 10 cities. I chose to be all around the country and to represent areas that have some of the highest ozone levels in their parts of the country. You can see that the sensitivity to ozone has been dropping around the U.S. And once again, that's because we're getting rid of the chemicals that cause ozone. And so this issue of warmer temperatures raising air pollution is simply a red herring. We're getting rid of the things that cause ozone, and so we're not going to have a problem in the future regardless of whether the climate warms. Another thing that the regulators didn't tell the legislators was that even though you might expect warmer temperatures, all else equal, to increase ozone, you'd also expect warmer temperatures to decrease particulate matter. The reason is that a substantial fraction of the particulate matter is what are called semi-volatile compounds, things that evaporate as it gets warmer. And that includes ammonium nitrate, which makes up a large part of particulate matter in the western United States, and a lot of organic compounds that are formed in the atmosphere that are semi-volatile and that condense at the lower temperatures but start evaporating when you get up to higher temperatures. Sorry, I keep showing you the wrong chart. What the regulators didn't mention was that you'd actually expect a large decline in particulate matter because of these higher temperatures. And because the regulators claim particulate matter kills many more people than ozone, you'd actually have a net decline in mortality from air pollution, even if they were right about ozone increasing, which they aren't. So the story about air pollution and climate change is actually a good one. We should see less particulate matter as a result of warming if it occurs, but the legislators weren't told that. Okay, so much for the observations of the climate. Let's talk about economics a little bit. Will reducing carbon dioxide make us wealthier? California Air Resources Board, CARB, claims that we will. CARB claims that implementing their program for AB 32, that's California's climate law, they claim that we'll have a $13 billion per year increase in personal income in 2020 due to the AB 32 regulations that CARB implements. CARB also claims that because of AB 1493, the fuel economy regulation, that there'll be a net savings to motorists of $1,700 per new car sold in the state. And the UC Berkeley Climate Change Center, which was commissioned by CARB to do some analyses of climate regulation, claims that we'll have an increase in gross state product of $74 billion per year in 2020 by meeting the AB 32 target. And these are not net economic benefits. These are net economic benefits of the regulations themselves. It doesn't even include any supposed benefits of reducing the CO2 and thereby reducing climate change. It's just the claim that the regulations themselves will make us richer. Now, if these claims were correct, we should do them whether we're worried about climate change or not. We should have CARB regulate us into wealth. If CARB is right, that means that and if UC Berkeley is right, that means that there are literally billions of dollars sitting on the table right now, and we're refusing to claim them. California's venture capitalists and entrepreneurs are refusing to claim this money, and they need to be forced by regulators to go grab that money. It just doesn't make sense. If that were true, we wouldn't need regulations to force them to do it. And in fact, CARB sent its climate plan out to 5 peer reviewers that were chosen by CARB, 5 economists, and they all panned the plan for claiming that it was going to have, as they put it, negative costs. And these peer reviewers were not people who don't think climate change is a problem. They think it's a problem, and they think that CARB should regulate it. But they were upset that what they thought was CARB's claiming that this was going to have net benefits rather than impose costs on society. Bob Stavens was one of the peer reviewers. I've just put up a couple of quotes from his peer review. He said that the economic analysis is terribly deficient in critical ways and should not be used by the state government or the public for assessing the likely cost of CARB's plans, and that CARB selectively included and excluded various policies in ways that would systematically underestimate costs. Peace and Atkins from the Pew Center, not known for opposing CO2 reductions, also had some pointed criticisms of the plan. It gives the appearance of justifying the chosen options rather than evaluating them, and that it was counterintuitive that there could be no net cost to the regulations. And finally, Matt Kahn of UCLA, who thought it was a surprising finding that manufacturing employment will grow even though electricity prices are predicted to rise under the plan, and that there's an implicit assumption that people won't have to give up anything to get these high mileage cars that CARB is going to force manufacturers to produce. In other words, that CARB essentially presumes that we can get 35 or 40 mile per gallon SUVs so that people won't have to give up any size or cargo space or leg room or anything else they value about a car in order to get these high mileage cars that CARB is going to force the manufacturers to make. Now, presumably, if manufacturers could make an SUV that got 40 miles per gallon now, they would do it, and then they'd beat out the competition to sell those cars. But since they're not doing it, that probably means that people have to give up a lot in order to get these high mileage cars. Either they'll have to pay a lot more for the new technologies necessary to deliver them, or they'll have to buy much smaller cars, or probably both. Now, every once in a while, someone does say what's really going on here with climate regulation. And Felicity Barringer just wrote a story for the New York Times where somebody did just that. One of the things state regulators are saying is that there's going to be a lot of new green jobs created by AB 32, but they also said that whether that's true or not, the fact that we're in a recession and have a lot less economic activity is going to make it a lot easier for us to meet the CO2 targets. And I think that's really the only way we're going to meet those targets, and that's by paying costs that are much higher than the benefits of the regulations. I want to close with a couple of quotes that I think are apt for any religious issue as climate change has become. For California regulators and for Californians, climate change has a powerful combination of religious zeal, bureaucratic empire building. For California Air Resources Board, they've just about doubled in size because of climate change. They have vast new powers that span the world. And there's also the adulation and prestige that come from being a leading edge agency that's saving the world. Because of California politics, they've unfortunately made us a guinea pig. So hopefully the rest of you will get a chance to see where we're going before you go too far down the same road. Thank you very much.